Good evening and welcome to Avenues to Wholeness, Finding Wholeness After Tragedy. My name is Reverend Lethalma Gimbata, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the Associate Executive Director at American Baptist Women's Ministries. American Baptist Women's Ministries is a Christ-centered ministry with a commitment to encourage and empower women and girls to serve God. American Baptist Women's Ministries is a diverse community of American Baptist women and girls serving in ministry in Christ's name in the United States, including Puerto Rico, as well as internationally. With local, area, region, state, and national levels of ministry, American Baptist Women's Ministries strives to create and sustain communities of passionately faithful, mission-minded women and girls engaged in worship, service, and friendship. Our ministries include domestic violence and human trafficking prevention and education, building beloved community, and developing leaders. This is the fourth webinar of our winter season. You can register and find out more about our upcoming webinars by visiting our website at abwomensministries.org/webinars. We have a few guidelines for your time with us. Tonight, you'll be muted throughout the presentation. However, you may use your raise hand icon during question and answer to be unmuted to ask a question, or you may type your question into the question box in your control panel. If you see a question written that is close to your question or is your question, you can upvote to emphasize another person's question, and we will address that question first. Lastly, but certainly not least, please complete the survey so that we can continue providing you with outstanding webinars. Our presenter for this evening is Ms. Sandra Roman, insurance broker and communications consultant. Sandra Roman hardly ever stays put. She enjoys traveling and has visited 17 countries so far. Sandra has a BA in public communications from the University of Puerto Rico and a master's in human resources and labor relations from Michigan State University. Her curiosity and determination have urged her to explore many passions, including photography, writing, translating, volunteering, sales, and management. Sandra has moved over 15 times and has held over 20 jobs, always looking to learn new skills and experience new industries. Sandra lives in Puerto Rico with her husband of 21 years, a writer and game developer, their daughters, and their dog, Sugar. And without further ado, I pass it over to Sandra.
Hello, good evening. It's very exciting to be here. I am so honored that Lethalma asked me to participate with you, and it's really nice to be connecting this way with so many women across the U.S., and hopefully some women from Puerto Rico have joined us tonight too. So I am really excited to be taking you through this topic of finding wholeness after the tragedy. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book that I wrote, but basically, I just want us to all connect along the topic that can touch anybody, which is how do I get over after a crisis or after a tragedy? And so we're going to move on to our slide number 2 here. And I'm sharing with you a quote from Susan Elizabeth Phillips. She's an author. I don't really read her books, but I found this quote and it was so appropriate. It says, "I finally figure out that not every crisis can be managed. As much as we want to keep ourselves safe, we can't protect ourselves from everything. If we want to embrace life, we also have to embrace chaos." And it's so true. I think another way of saying what Susan Elizabeth Phillips says here is was written already in John 16:33, where it says, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world," which is really the hope that we share. So we will all have issues, we will all have trouble, and we know that that's part of life. So in order to enjoy being alive, we must also face some kind of trouble. So moving on to the next slide, I post a couple of questions here, and they're superimposed on a picture of something chaotic, like the aftermath of something really terrible. And the questions are, what is a crisis and what is tragedy? And I think it's important that we start this conversation by defining this. I like this definition of crisis that says that crisis is intense problem or danger. Um, and I like this definition because I think we overuse the word crisis. And sometimes we say, I'm in a crisis. And then when you go to look for, okay, what's going on? It's really not an intense problem or danger. It's maybe just a regular problem or an issue that we're facing. But when we think of crisis, we're really thinking about something major. It could happen to anyone. Many times it's not preventable, and we can prepare for certain things, but not for all of them. So I'm thinking of a crisis like facing a terminal illness, the loss of a loved one, natural disaster, losing a job, and those kinds of things that we all go through. But sometimes we say, oh, I lost my keys. I can't go to work. I'm in a crisis. Well, no, you just lost your keys. It's something temporary, and you will be able to overcome it really quickly. So I think that now that we have kind of defined what crisis or tragedy is, we can talk a little bit about what we can do. And if we move on to the next picture, this is a picture that I found on the internet, and this is a picture of Hurricane Maria when it was coming over Puerto Rico a couple of years ago. And this is a quote here from a book, something that I wrote online on social media the day before. It says, we are preparing for the imminent arrival of Hurricane Maria. Our first preparation was humbly bowing in prayer, asking God to have mercy on us. Because it was such a huge system like we have never seen in our lifetimes, we were prepared. So we put up storm windows, which are not normal here, is something that you only use during hurricanes. And we collected all the things from the yard. We make sure that all the windows were closed. We had our batteries, our flashlights, our non-perishables, and we knew that we would probably lose power. But we had no idea the extent of what we were going to go through. So some crises could be forewarned, like in the case of a hurricane. But there's a lot of crisis and tragedy that we go through that we cannot really prepare for, like going through a car accident or surviving an explosion or something. Those are things that we can't really prevent. And those are things that nobody's really prepared for. So you have to react once you go through something like this. And first you have to do the immediate things of making sure that you are preserving your life and property as much as you can. But then comes the time of, okay, what do I do next? And one of the things that we have to do is ask for help. I think once we realize that we are in a crisis, once we accepted it, and once we have gone through that very first event or episode, the next thing that we need to look into is asking for help. So the next picture I have here is a picture of a person going down the path, and on the one side there's like green grass, but on the other side there's like this desert. And I think what it represents to me is the fact that there is help out there. Sometimes when we're going through a tragedy, we feel like nobody understands what we're going through, and there's no way that we could be helped. So the first thing that I like to think of when I see this picture of facing tragedy is, where does my help comes from? Where's my strength really based on? Is my strength based on my physical strength? Is it based on my mental strength? Is it based on anything within me? And I guess the best answer for me to that question comes from Psalm 121 and the second verse that says, my strength comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So we have to be reminded in a time of crisis that we are not alone, and that we have a superpower, and the superpower is our trust in God, because He is much greater than any tragedy that we could go through. So our spiritual strength comes from God, and he also helps us with discernment. So we have to distinguish between the things that we can change and the things that we must accept. Some things that we can't change. Let's see, maybe I'll ask this question and you guys can type in there things that you cannot change, because I think it's always interesting when I ask this question in groups of people and they go thinking for things they cannot change, and they might say the weather, you can't really change the weather. But the truth is that there are a lot of things you can't change. You can't change other people. You can change the results of things that are already ongoing. And then we ask ourselves, well, what are the things that I could change? Okay, so here is really the key to looking towards a solution after a tragedy. What are the things you can change? You can change the way you think. You can change your attitude, and you can change your actions. In other words, we can only change ourselves. And this is very important because once we discern between those things that cannot be changed and need to be accepted, we can start really moving forward. And this is easier said than done, especially after a tragedy, like being diagnosed with a terminal illness. That's something really hard to accept. But you cannot change the past. You can only change your attitude towards what's happening to you. And another thing that's very important to do is ask for help. And asking for help and giving help are very interesting. I came to find that out through some of the work that I was doing after Hurricane Maria. Because you think, well, certainly I know what people needed. I mean, if somebody lost their house, they need everything. They need money, they need clothing, they need a place to live, they need all the furnishings. But you will be surprised when you ask somebody what you need and what's the most important thing for you right now. And people in similar circumstances will have different answers because we all react differently to change. So I think as women, we tend to be very empathetic, and we want to help people. And sometimes people need to be listened to, but sometimes they really need professional help. So I think we need to distinguish between the times of those things that we can provide for, or we can support somebody in, and when they really need to go and look for professional help. The same thing, or one of the things that I learned the hard way is that really it's not very helpful to say to people, call me if you need anything. And how many times have we said that? I've said that. Call me if you need anything. I am here for you. Well, a person who's going through a tragedy might need so many things that they might be really overwhelmed. And they don't really know what to ask for when you say, call me if you need anything. So what ends up happening most of the time is they don't call you, and then you don't do anything. And then you feel bad that you didn't help them, but there was really a misunderstanding. So I think it's easier if you identify things that you could do and you offer those things specifically. Like say, well, I could drive you to your next appointment if you're not feeling good, or if you don't have transportation, or I could come over and watch your children for a few hours if you need to go out or if you want to rest. I can make some of those appointments and calls for you if you're not feeling well. Hey, I can bring food. I could pray for you right now. There's so many things we could do, and we need to be specific. We need to identify what are those things that I could really give without compromising myself, without coming up short, and what are the things that this person is willing to accept. And sometimes those two things are not the same, and it's okay. But you need to be a little more specific when offering help, and also when asking for help. So one of the things that helps us is remembering our victories. And you're seeing a picture in your screen of people who are like running to the finish line. I'm not a runner, but I can imagine how it feels when you get to the finish line of a very long race, because it was something that you did that was very hard, and now you see the end in sight. So sometimes when we're going through trouble, when we are going through tragedy, it's very helpful to remember that you have come out of trouble in the past. And one of the verses that I found in the Bible that talks about this is from one obscure chapter, which is First Chronicles 16, verse 11. It says, "Look to the Lord and his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced." And I like that part about remember the wonders he has done, his miracles, because God has helped us in the past so many times. And so remembering those victories is going to give us strength for the current fight. And that's something that is also true of others. So when you're helping somebody who is down, who is going through a very hard time, remind them of things that you have witnessed God doing in their lives, because that will give them the motivation to move forward, and it will inspire them. Now, we're going to look at a picture of a little girl who is using some binoculars here, and she's looking at something that's probably far away. And I love this picture because sometimes we need to change our focus. We need to look elsewhere. As soon as possible after you are over the most dire times in your tragedy, you need to change your focus from yourself and onto others. And one of the ways that you can help yourself is by helping other people, believe it or not, because this will help you heal. On the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and the earthquakes that we had here on last January, only a month and a few weeks ago, I learned of two Baptist women who had lost their homes, one in each of these events. And during the hurricane, this lady who lost her home ended up becoming the director of a shelter where people were living because they had lost their homes too. And in the second case, after the earthquakes, this lady who lost her house had became a volunteer cook at a shelter that was being run out of one of our churches. And I always think it's so amazing that these people had lost their own home, and instead of looking for help for themselves or feeling sorry for themselves, they responded to the call and went to help other people. So it's kind of surprising, but I also know from my own experience that is one of the best ways to help yourself, is to stop feeling sorry for yourself, stop only thinking about yourself, and get busy helping somebody. And you know, the Bible says that it's more blessed to give than to receive. And that is one of those biblical principles that once you live it, you know how true it is. So once you are stable enough and you have taken care of your basic needs, look around to see somebody else who might need you. It's kind of like that thing that they said in the airplane, after you put on your own mask, look for others and then help them. Well, the same is true of times of troubles. Your presence could be a real blessing to somebody else. So staying on your own grief is robbing you from being able to participate in being a blessing to somebody else. Now let's talk about something that I think is very important that sometimes we don't get here. Sometimes we don't even get to help somebody else. We just focus so much on our tragedy. But I found that finding an outlet to express yourself is very important. And so I'm going to ask that if you're able to type in the comment section things that you like to do that are your outlet of expression, because I want to know what we have here. Do we have painters? Do we have quilters? Do we have scrapbookers? What kind of things do you like to do with your hands? Or what kind of pastimes have you enjoyed? Are you a photographer? Do you like to write journals? So if you type along, Lathelma will read us your answers and we'll know what kind of crowd we are accompanied by tonight. I think healing is a multi-step process. So I think, of course, we need prayer. Sometimes we need counseling. We might need practical help from other people. And as we're moving out of the tragedy and into the healing process, one of the things that could be very, very helpful is documenting your feelings, expressing your feelings, using some kind of art form to move on from one step to the next throughout your grief or throughout your recovery process. And in some cases, in many cases, the only outlet that we use is talking. So it is very common after a tragedy when you visit people that they will sit there and tell you what they were feeling like during the day of the tragedy. So in the case of Hurricane Maria, we were visiting people, bringing practical help afterwards. And in every case, it was something that people needed to do was to tell me how it was for them at their house. Even though I lived through the same experience, they needed to vent, they needed to express that, they needed to kind of um, remember the details about it and tell me how they felt and how was it afterwards. And that was just something that they had to do. But sometimes we just stay in that stage and we just keep repeating it and telling everybody who comes to us about our crisis or about our trouble. And people are not professional counselors. So after a while, if you tell the same story to the same person, they're going to start not knowing what to do with you. And they might start dodging your calls or not asking you too much about how you feel because they're afraid that they're going to remind you of your trouble. So I think one of the things we need to be careful of is that talking is good and is necessary, but sometimes if your trouble is not feeling like it's easing and you're thinking that it just feels like it keeps growing instead of decreasing, that might be time to go for professional counseling because you might need to work through some issues with somebody who can more than listen to you, also guide you. However, when you're feeling better, one of the ways that you could document your feelings or express them is through art. Find an outlet of expression because it will be like therapy. So I am not an artist, so I can't. Yeah, go ahead.
A variety of 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 artists here and people, just people who have found modes of expression. We have several people who love journaling and quilting.
Okay.
We have someone that loves coloring books. I'm also
Yeah.
coloring books, collecting shells at the beach, jewelry making. Someone said they love to read, and they mean like actually hold the book, not online reading. Walking and meditating in nature.
Oh, those are all excellent. Let's take the ones that have to do with creating things with your hands. That's first category. I'm not an artist, but I love to create things with my hands. I think I started that very young, and my mom was certainly a model of that for me because she could do wonders with her hands. She can sew, she can crochet, she could do um, a lot of different, just very crafty things. So I was always surrounded by that and trying new things. And so I found that even though I'm not a natural artist, like I can't really draw, I'm very good at copying. So I can get an idea and copy it. And so for a while, I did a lot of scrapbooking, card making, and things of that nature. I also love walking in nature. I think that's just very therapeutic. In our case here in Puerto Rico, we have the beach. So going to the beach and going for a walk in the sand and feeling the water in your toes is just so it has such a healing power. I love it. But I also find that just losing yourself in the activity itself is part of the healing. So when you are painting or carving or quilting or doing something with your hands and you're just going through the process, and I love those coloring books too that they have now for adults. Those are wonderful. And so you have all of your colors and you're trying to decide which palette you're going to go with. And those take a long time, which is actually good because it gets your mind off of your day-to-day issues and it kind of lets you rest because sometimes we just keep going over and over our problems in our mind and we don't find any rest. So in my case, what I did was I started documenting the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And I'm going to tell you a little more about that now because that was a big event in our lives in um, 2018. Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and it was devastation everywhere. It was like the worst we had seen in our lifetime because I think the one before that had been like 90 years prior and nobody was alive anymore to tell us about it, or very few people. So Hurricane Maria was really, really bad. It was a category 5 and it came through the island in the very late hours of the night, early hours of the morning of September 20th. And it was the worst sound I've ever heard. It was like howling. The wind was so strong, and it was so dark out because the power was out, and it seemed to last a long time, even though it wasn't really. Thank goodness, it wasn't really stationary. It moved through, but it was very powerful. So what we saw the very next day was like the mountains looked like they had been burnt. The trees had no leaves. Everything was brown. The houses were destroyed. Many roofs were lifted, especially those that are made out of aluminum. And there was garbage everywhere. There were falling electric posts everywhere. It was hard to drive. Some roads were blocked, and there were just destruction, everywhere. And people were like so quiet and solemn, and just, they were just so glad to be alive. But it was so um, I just want to say that it hit so many areas of the island. There were so many people in need of help at the same time. And so the government was shut down, everything had collapsed, and help wasn't really moving. And so people had to clear out their own homes, their own yards, take all the garbage outside, take all the wet furniture and all the things that they had lost and put it on the street and find their ways. Some neighborhoods people got together and they started clearing trees so that they could communicate again. Some roads were washed off, and some bridges also were torn down. So it was really, really bad. We at our house, we didn't have electricity for 90 days, and there were people who were without electricity for much longer than that. We didn't have running water for a month. We ran out of the water in our water tank after about 15 days. So the day to day became survival. It was like a tragedy that just kept lingering on and on. And one of the things that I did during that time was I started documenting what was happening, because we had family in the US, including my younger brother, many cousins and distant relatives that lived there. And I knew that because we couldn't communicate, because phone lines were also down, that it was very hard for them not to know what was happening. I had lived through a hurricane in the US. So there was a hurricane that hit Puerto Rico while I lived in the US. And I knew what it was like to be on that side of the TV screen, only seeing the devastation, because the news is always going to show the worst. And now being able to talk to your family members. So I decided, well, I'm going to try to communicate with my family members through social media, because we had a very weak signal. So we could connect with text and we could write on social media, but it was very hard to have a phone call, because the signal would be so weak that you will lose signal, and you will be your calls will be dropped every few minutes. So after we regained signal, which was probably a whole week after the hurricane, we started communicating, and I started writing little reflections on what was happening. And I was very careful to always keep a positive spin on it, because I knew that my relatives, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my sister-in-law, and my brother, and all those people were reading were going to be suffering if all I wrote was about my suffering. So I was very careful to always reflect on things and kind of go beyond just describing what was happening, but also being realistic. So, and the more I wrote, the more my relatives and friends in the US said that they wanted to read more. So please keep sharing. And after a while, after about a month or two, when we still didn't have power and we were at home, spending a lot of time trying to look for things to do, I started putting all of these reflections together into a book. And I just started building chapters around topics, because as the tragedy went on and on for so long, and as the time was progressing, we were experiencing different things. So we were experiencing just moving on from clearing out our house to perhaps taking the kids back to school when school reopened, or trying to do the insurance claims, or trying to refocus on things that we had started before the hurricane that were interrupted. So I just kind of took every area of those things that I've been writing about and started making chapters. And I didn't know what this book was going to be but I knew that writing was keeping me busy. Because one thing that I didn't tell you is that before the hurricane, I had been self-employed. And of course, the hurricane took out all possibility of doing the work that I was doing before. And I had also been looking for a job because this self-employment wasn't really something I wanted to do long term. So I've been looking for a job, and I have been already doing interviews, and I was kind of like in a second round of interviews right before Maria hit, and that job opportunity disappeared, and there was no more opportunities. So I have a lot of time to think and not a lot to do. So I decided, okay, well, let's make this project our priority. And I started writing, and I started putting together these stories, and then I started looking through the photos that we had taken to see which photos I would include with the story. And I wrote it in English, and I call it Staying Strong because that's what I would sign off in my social media postings. I would always say Staying Strong in Puerto Rico, or Staying Strong, Sandra Roman, and I just kind of like sign off like that. So I thought, okay, this is a pretty clear indication that this could be a title. So I had a working title, I had my chapters, I was putting it all together, and I wrote it in English first. And then while somebody was editing that, I decided, well, I still have time, I still don't have a job, still a lot of free time here, so I'm going to translate it into Spanish. So I translated the whole book into Spanish. And so I kind of felt like while I was writing this, I was reliving it, but I was also healing. So as I was typing and describing and putting more detail into my initial reflections, sometimes I would cry because it was like being there again. Then I had to rewrite it in Spanish. And so it was like I lived the whole experience 3 times. The first time in real life, the second time when I wrote it in English, and the third time when I translated it into Spanish. But every time it was less painful. And so writing it, living it was the most painful part. Writing about it was a little less painful. Translating it was a little less painful. And then after the book was written and it got published on Amazon, which itself was an amazing thing, then when I would go and talk to people about the book, the pain was more removed in time, if you know what I mean. So I think writing and using the book as an outlet for my personal tragedy really was a way of finding wholeness for me. So I would really recommend that. So some of you wrote that you like journaling. I think journaling is very powerful because you can just put in the pages all these things that you're feeling, and it can help unload your burden from your heart. And also you can read it later and reflect and see how much you have overcome whatever was making you so sad or so hurt, and see it with the benefit of much more time, and see how much you've healed. And then it becomes your testimony. It becomes your testament that God has been good to you even though you went through something terrible, and look where you have come. And I think that is the life of the Christian, really. I've been reflecting this week. I'm using the Bible in 1 year app to reflect. And Job was one of the books that was in the readings. And I've been reflecting on Job and his terrible friends and all the things that they would say to him while he was going through all this tragedy. And thinking, well, we need to be more like Job and less like his friends, because they were not really helpful. They were doing the normal things that we humans do, which is blame or trying to find why this happened. Well, sometimes tragedy happens to no fault of our own. Sometimes God allows certain things to happen in our lives, and it's not that is the destiny that he has for us or what he wants for us, but it's something that he allows to happen because he knows that he's going to be there with us. He knows that the most important thing about us, which is our souls, are going to be kept safe in him, because he's our refuge in times of trouble, and he's our high tower. So he knows what we can take, and he knows that he's going to be there no matter what. So therefore, instead of sometimes focusing so much on trying to understand the reason of why tragedy happened, I think we need to focus more on the healing and focus more on what's going to happen next? What have I learned from this? How has this tragedy make me stronger? So I'm going to keep talking because we still have more time, but I wanted to pose a question and for you guys to comment. What personal tragedy have you overcome? And I want you to type in there, whatever it has been. I can't really see your names. Nobody else knows what you're typing, so you could be very honest and vulnerable here. Because I think as you type those words, you're typing your testimony. You're saying, I went through this, but God was there with me, and He was my high tower. He was my refuge, and I have overcome this. I'm now on the other side. And so if you're going through something like, if you don't mind sharing and you've gone through something like that, we would like to hear what you have to say, because I think it will be helpful for others. Telma, have you seen anything? Has anybody typed anything yet?
I think people are still
still processing. Okay, so we'll give you some time. And while we do that, I like to, well, I'll tell you one more anecdote before we go on to the next. So after I wrote the book and the book got published, and I was amazed that, local libraries wanted to, or local bookstores wanted to sell it, I started getting invited to talk about it on the radio and at church groups and in different places. I went to this church in a town in the north, and I know this town because I used to live there when I was a kid. And I knew that it was a very vulnerable area, vulnerable to flooding. And there were a lot of housing that were built not to code in that town. So I accepted this invitation to go speak to a choir. They were having a retreat, and it was a church choir. So I talked about the book, and then when people at the end, some of them wanted to get copies and they wanted me to sign them. I spoke to this man who started telling me that he had actually lost his house during the hurricane, and that he was staying elsewhere, but from the place he was staying, he could see the roof of his house being lifted up and blown away. And he told me that he was living now with a relative, and that him and his wife, his daughter and his granddaughter were all sharing a room at a relative's house, and that FEMA had not really approved help for his house reconstruction. So he was really down and sad, and he had been really grumpy and short with his wife. And through my talk, he realized, that he needed to change that, and he needed to look at his experience through new eyes. And while he was saying that, my heart was breaking. I was like, why are you buying this book? I should be giving you this book for free. I just wanted to comfort him, because I could tell that he had suffered much greater, physical loss than I had. But then I realized that perhaps me bringing this topic to this group that he wasn't even expecting probably to be talking about that day gave him the outlet to express himself. And that's also part of the healing process. So I think when we share our testimony, we reach people in a very personal way, and we allow them to see that it's okay to talk about their loss and to talk about how they plan to move forward. All right. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. We had some people write divorce as one of the difficult experiences, a mother's death when they were 19, being diagnosed with breast cancer 2 times, 2007 and 2018. Father dying from cancer, having to move to the U.S. for 6 months after Hurricane Maria. Another breast cancer, stage 3 breast cancer diagnosis, having chemo, surgery, radiation, more chemo, and now lymphedema. No family nearby. Still trying to cope with the death of a mother and sister within 1 month, but they're finding strength. Looking at photos and remember special times has helped them feel strong. And someone accepting terminal illness.
Wow. Yeah, I think I commend you all for sharing that, because these are your testimonies. These are the wounds that are now turning into scars, which means you have gone through them, and God is allowing you to heal, but He's also taking you through this valleys and being there with you through the danger and the tears and the scary times, definitely. Well, let's move on to the next picture, because now I want us to explore something um, and maybe challenge you. And I have a picture here again of the same life raft as before, because I think the when somebody's drowning, it's very similar to going through a tragedy. And so the question that I'm posing is, what can we do in our local churches to help women find wholeness after different events? So I typed in here divorce, unemployment, cancer, loss of a child or a spouse. It could also be loss of a parent, and depression, because I've seen these as some of the most common ones. And just thinking from the perspective of women, the things that are the most difficult to overcome for us. So, what can my church do to help women find wholeness after divorce? What can we do after finding wholeness after unemployment? Because sometimes that somebody's career is really important to them, and losing that livelihood could be traumatic. Definitely, the incidence of cancer is pretty high, and it's never something easy to go through. It's like we know what it is, we hear from other people, but when it's us, it's very different and it's very hard. And the fear that it can come back is something that stays also. And then, of course, the loss of a child or a spouse or somebody that's not supposed to die before you, it's really hard. But even the death of parents that we expect them to die before we do, but still not easy to get over it. And any of these things can lead to depression. But sometimes depression comes even without any of these things being present. Um, so our churches sometimes are like hospitals, and people come to church with their problems, and they come to church with their needs. And the church has two choices: we can meet their needs or we can ignore their needs. And if we ignore their needs are not going away. So a person who's struggling with divorce or cancer or depression, they're going to take it with them everywhere. They're going to take it to Sunday school class. They're going to take it to that outing. They're going to take it to small group. They're going to bring it with them everywhere they go. And they're going to press for their need to be met because they're hurting. And so it's kind of like if you were hurting physically, if you just, I don't know, stepped on glass right before coming into church. You can't just go to the service and pretend nothing's happening because you're hurting. So you're going to be dripping blood through the carpet, and you're going to be asking for somebody to give you a Band-Aid. You're going to say, I'm in pain. You're going to be holding your foot. And the same thing happens with emotional pain that has not healed. So I wonder why sometimes it is that we kind of ignore these things and try to go about our church's program and not make room for people with these needs. So I want you to be thinking about sharing with me and with the rest of the ladies on the call if your church is doing something for any of these types of issues or any other issues that are similar, and what have you done, and how is that working? I know that my church, for example, has a prayer group that meets in the morning. And so people who are retired or stay at home can go to this prayer group, and they have found that it's helpful for them to talk about their needs together, to visit one another. So it has really turned kind of like into a support group for seniors. So most of the group members are seniors, they're retired, they had very healthy, active lives at one point. And now many of them are empty nesters or widows, or they're dealing with serious health conditions. So they meet together once a week, and they pray and they sing and they talk and they visit. And for them, that is very helpful. And that is probably more helpful than going to Sunday service. to be honest, because on Sunday service, you don't get to talk because it's a big group of people. So that's one of the things that we have done that we have found that has been very helpful. But I'm sure that depending on the demographics of your church and the makeup of your church, you can find that other ideas have been useful. Also, recently discovered something called Bible journaling. And so, Bible journaling is doing a Bible study and then using art to demonstrate what you've learned. So, I've been practicing Bible journaling in two different settings, and I'm going to share this with you because I think you could use this as an idea for your women's group or your church to do something different that could be helpful to people healing, because expressing ourselves artistically, as we said before, is one of those things that are very helpful. So in Bible journaling, you normally have a Bible study time. And then you pick something that you learned during that Bible study. It could be an image, it could be a phrase or a word or a series of words. And then you illustrate them on the margin of your Bible, because there's the special Bibles that come with some blank spaces for you to do that. And so I belong to two different groups. I go to this group once a month, and they are ladies from different churches, and they're mothers and grandmothers and some teenage girls also. And so somebody would take turns teaching, somebody would bring the teaching, and then somebody else would teach us an artistic technique to illustrate what we just learned. And then everybody makes their own version, and then we share them. And it's very therapeutic, and it's a very beautiful time together with other ladies. And so I started learning that from that group, and then I decided to incorporate that into a Bible study cell group. So I look for ladies in my church who live near each other. And we all travel to the next town to go to church, but we happen to live near each other. And we are all adults who have teenage children or young ladies in our families. So we decided to get together and do our own Bible journaling. And so we looked for deciding on a place. We kind of tested out a couple of food courts. So we went to the mall, went to the food court, put a couple of tables together and said, okay, let's do our Bible study here and let's do our Bible journaling. And after testing a couple of malls, we decided there was one that had better lighting. So that's the one that we've been visiting. And we go about 2 or 3 times a month. And we get together, and there's food, there's parking, there's free air conditioning, there's great lighting. And we get together and we study the Bible, and then we illustrate it. And then we share our works of art with one another, and we explain why we picked the images or the words that we did. And then we compare, because sometimes we study a whole chapter of the Bible, but then 2 or 3 of us decide to illustrate exactly the same verse. And so even though we picked the same verse, our illustrations are very different. And I find that through this Bible study, we have grown not only closer to God, but closer to one another, because it's a small setting and people are able to be honest and open. So those are two groups that I have recently joined and one created, that are ways that are helping me find wholeness. And so if anybody has typed anything, I'm going to ask Telma to tell us if there are any comments.
We just had one comment. Someone said that their pastor prayed for them every Sunday, and the pastoral prayer every Sunday, receiving texts from friends, just asking, how are you? Can I do anything to help? Was very uplifting for them. And just thinking about what you said reminded me of a reading that I was reading recently. It was by someone who was battling depression, and they shared an experience that they had with a friend that came to visit them. And I just wanted to read a little bit of what they reflected, because I feel like it really spoke to a lot of what you were talking about. So he says, one of the people One of the several people that stopped by was a man who, having asked my permission to do so, stopped by late every afternoon, sat me down in a chair, knelt in front of me, removed my shoes and socks, and for half an hour simply massaged my feet. He found the one place in my body where I could still experience bodily feeling and feel connected with the human race. He rarely spoke a word, but when he did, he never gave advice, but simply mirrored my condition. He would say, I can sense your struggle today, or it feels like you are getting stronger. I could not always respond, but his words were deeply helpful. They reassured me that I could still be seen by at least one person. Life giving knowledge in the midst of an experience that makes one feel annihilated and invisible. It is almost impossible to put into words what my friend's ministry meant to me. Perhaps it is enough to say that I now understand the biblical stories of Jesus and his foot washings at New Depth. He said,
Wow.
yeah, he said, the poet Rilke says, love consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and salute each other. That is the kind of love my friend offered. He never tried to invade my awful inwardness with false comfort or advice, but simply stood on its boundaries, modeling the respect for me and my journey and the courage to let it be that I myself needed if I were to endure. That's just a little excerpt, but
Wow, very powerful.
mhm.
It reminds me of this one thing I learned, which is because everybody goes through struggles differently and everybody needs their own time and their own way to heal, we need to be very careful not to presume to know what the other person is going through, but ask, and just listen. And sometimes also remind them that it's okay that they're hurting, even though everybody else seems to be going uh, um, on with their lives like nothing happened. So this is especially true of people who are recovering from the loss of a loved one or depression. They are still perhaps in the very dark days of sadness. And so they come to us, like, for example, they go to church and we are like having just a joy, joy, joy kind of service. And everybody's so happy, and every word that is read is so uplifting, and everything is praises to the Lord. And this person is like living through the darkest day of their lives. And so we need to be sensitive to allow people to just go through their own process. And it's okay to ask, it's okay to bring it up. It's not like they are ignoring it. So why should we, right? I mean, it should be so weird to be going through something really tragic and for people to just walk around you ignoring it. So I think that's one of the things we need to be sensitive about. Other thing somebody mentioned in the comments was the texting. And I found that some people have developed very strong ministries of sending messages to others. And I know a particular woman, she is the wife of a pastor. I've known her for many years, and she suffers from a very difficult health conditions. She has several health conditions that are very painful, and so she can't really go out a lot. She can do a lot physically. So she sits at home and she prays for people. She does a lot of singing, because that she could do, and she sends messages. And I find that sometimes her messages, oftentimes, come just at the time where I needed to read that. Her messages are usually a Bible verse or a portion of a Bible verse, or just an uplifting phrase. And she sends them to different people that she has on her list. And I think that's such a cool ministry that she could do from her bed or her home. And sometimes we sell ourselves short on what we could do to spread some goodness and some good Christian love. So instead of thinking, well, I can no longer do this, I can no longer drive, or I can no longer do physical things because I'm sick, let's always think, okay, among the things I can do, what could I do that will be helpful and uplifting to others? And I think God will give you some creativity if you ask. He can give you some wisdom about what to do and how to do it, and you can use your own creativity as well. So for those of you who might be curious and wanted to read more about our experience after Hurricane Maria, you can find my book, Staying Strong, Diary of the Survival of Hurricane Maria, on Amazon. And I promise it's not going to be all doom and gloom. We also share in there some of my personal testimony and things that I was reflecting upon and some lessons that I learned during that time and afterwards meditating on it. I also want to encourage you, if you like writing and you thought about writing a book, is now more possible than ever because of self-publishing. Self-publishing is the ability to write a book, upload it into the Amazon platform, and not having to invest a lot of money because people would Amazon would print it only when people buy it, and then they keep a portion of the revenue. Most of it goes to them because they're the ones doing all the work of printing it and keeping it and all that. And then you get a portion of the revenue comes to you. But I think it's so cool to be able to share your story of something great that God did in your life with as many people as possible. So if you're interested in that, I encourage you to do a lot of reading. When I was self-publishing this book, I didn't have a mentor and I had never done this before. So I did a lot of studying and reading about how to self-publish, how to build my, for example, my book cover, what to write in the back of the book, all of that I found online. So if you are interested, I encourage you to do that. There might be some people out there that are just waiting to read your story, to be encouraged and to be lifted up. And why not? You can add author to your list of things that you have accomplished. And it might not, you're not going to make any money. Now, let me tell you that, because self-publishing is not a profitable thing, but it's very fulfilling. And so if you have a story that you've been keeping, dust it off, have somebody read it and help you clean it up and go for it, because it's a worthwhile pursuit. Thelma, are there any other comments or
just
thoughts here?
About more ways that people encourage those who may be suffering. There's a group of women that make prayer shawls and give them to those who are sick. Another friend who texts scriptures and pictures to company texts every day to help other women feel to know that they're being prayed for and thought of. So thank you so much for sharing your story and empowering us to also remember our stories and to share them and express them in whatever ways we feel comfortable. I think what I took from this conversation was really when you said the more you told your story, the more you healed. And I think that was just a powerful thing for me to resonate with, because I think often it's hard for us to relive some of those really painful times of our lives. But if we want to heal and to live into the wholeness that God has promised us, we have to reflect and remember and I think the more we reflect, also the more we see God's hand at work in our stories. So
Definitely.
Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you so much for allowing the Holy Spirit to use you and to share how you live into the wholeness that God desired for you. So thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Please fill out the survey. We would love to hear how you experienced this webinar, and we hope that you have a wonderful, blessed evening. Thank you so much for being on, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks for our final webinar.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Bye-bye.